Cryptid Hunters by Roland Smith. Copyrighted by 2005 by Roland Smith. All rights reserved. Cryptozoology. Noun. The study of animals such as the Sasquatch, the Yeti, the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra, and others whose existence have not yet been proven scientifically. There are thought to be more than 200 cryptids in existence today. 1. The terrible news. Marty and Grace O'Hara were twins, but you wouldn't know it if you saw them together. Marty has brown hair, eyes the color of rain clouds, and he is a foot taller than his sister. Grace has black hair, startling blue eyes, the color of robin's eggs, and she is a foot smarter than her brother. The O'Hara twins were at the Omega Opportunity Preparatory School in Switzerland when they received the worst news of their lives. Marty was illustrating a comic book with his best friend and roommate, Luther Smith, when his art instructor, Mr. Umber, tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You are wanted in the headmaster's office again." Marty shrugged. He was sent to Dr. Bartholomew Beasel's office at least once a week, sometimes 2 or 3 times, for various infractions of the rules, of which there were many. The only thing that surprised him was that this time Luther wasn't being summoned as well. They were usually punished together, which saved the headmasters a great deal of time and effort. "Give my regards to Dr. Riesel," Luther said. "I will," Marty assured him. As always, Marty took his time getting to the office. He chatted with friends, went to the restroom to muss his hair and pull his shirt tail out. This drove the headmaster wild, and stopped in the kitchen to tell the chef he would be by later to help her roll out the dough for the cheese biscuits. When he finally arrived at the office, he was shocked to find his sister, Grace, sitting on one of the uncomfortable chairs outside the headmaster's door. "What are you doing here, little Grace? Never broke the rules." Grace stared at him mutely, with an expression he hadn't seen on her face in a very long time. It worried him. "When we get inside," he said, "you would better let me do the talking." Grace started to respond, but was interrupted by the massive door swinging open, and the tall, skeletal Dr. Bartholomew Beasel beckoning them into his inner sanctum. Seated around his long conference table were the school's nurse, counselor, chaplain, their 2 dormitory supervisors, and 3 teachers who had known the twins since they began attending the school 7 years before. Marty looked at the staff's grim, solemn expressions and knew that something had gone very, very wrong. "I didn't do it," he insisted. Dr. Beasel ignored Marty's shirt tail, his wild hair, and his all too familiar disclaimer. There has been a terrible accident," he said. "I'm afraid your parents are—" Grace fainted before Dr. Beasel was about to finish. The nurse jumped up from her chair and, together with a chaplain and counselor's help, laid her out on the sofa. "I'll get my smelling salts," the nurse said, and ran out of the office. Marty, who had seen Grace's emotions overwhelm her like this before, was not overly concerned. He glared around the room in angry frustration at the fussing adults until he could stand it no longer, then shouted, "Our parents are what?" Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at him helplessly. Dr. Beazle slithered over and put his long, slender arm around his least favorite student's shoulders. "I'm afraid your parents are missing," he said. Marty sank into the nearest chair. "Both of them?" Dr. Beazle gave him a sad nod. "A helicopter crash in the Amazon. The pilot was found dead and conflagration." Marty blinked. What?" He didn't know what the word meant, but it sounded bad. Grace, who had recovered without smelling salts and was now sobbing uncontrollably, said, "A fire, Marty. A terrible fire." Marty joined his sister in her bewildered despair. The next morning, the news was all over the local papers and on the lips of every student and teacher in the school. The twins retreated to Grace's private table in the back of the school library to escape all the sympathetic murmurs and curious stares. Grace spent more time at this table than she did in the dormitory room. She shared with her best friend Brenda Scrivens. No one was allowed to use Grace's table. "I have something to tell you," she said, holding her stuffed monkey. At least it was thought to be a monkey. The fabric was covered with patches and stitches that looked like scars. Its left arm, mouth, and ears were long gone. She'd had it since she was a baby, and called it Monkey. It was never far away from her. Marty referred to it as the Frankenstein monkey. He was seated across from her. Scattered over the table were several newspapers, open books, crumpled tissues, Grace's moleskin journal, and scraps of paper filled with mathematical equations which looked like Egyptian hieroglyphs to Marty, and made just about as much sense. "But before I tell you," Grace continued, "you have to promise not to say a word about it to anyone else." A promise between the twins was a sacred pact that could not be broken unless the one who had promised was released from the promise by the one who had asked for the promise. A promise was sealed by giving Monkey's the remaining arm a squeeze. Marty squeezed Monkey's arm. Grace nodded and took a deep breath. "Remember those nightmares I used to have when I was little?" "How could I forget?" Marty answered. "They nearly drove you crazy." "Don't tell me they're back." "They're back." Marty shuddered. No wonder she'd looked so tense outside the Weasel's door. The nightmares had bothered her from the time she was 2.5 years old until she was 6. When Grace was a little girl, 2 or 3 times a week, she would wake up screaming. And when she had calmed down enough to speak, she had virtually no recollection of what the dream was about. "I thought you'd outgrown all that," Marty said. The nightmares had stopped after the twins arrived at the boarding school. "I did too," Grace shook her head. "But they're back." "Do you remember anything?" Marty asked. "No, but there's something very familiar about all this. Deja vu. And if I've been through all this before..." "Well, I haven't," Marty said, feeling as if ants were crawling on his neck. Grace sometimes had this effect on him. She opened one of the newspapers and spread it out on the desk. "Have you seen this article?" He looked down at the newspaper. Accompanying the long article describing the accident was a dramatic color photograph of the twins' father, Timothy O'Hara. The photo had been taken by their mother, and the caption below it read, "Silver O'Hara's final photograph." "Mother's last kiss," he whispered, staring at his father's handsome face, trying to hold back tears. Their mother believed that taking a photograph was like giving someone a kiss. She had told them if there was no affection as the shadow released, the photograph was not worth taking. "She must have taken this on Mount Everest," Marty commented. Their parents had reached the summit just before they flew off to South America to write an article about the rainforest. In the photo, their father was smiling at their mother with a mild amusement. His oxygen mask and goggles were pulled down around his neck. His face was wind-burned and slightly paler around his gray eyes, where the goggles had been. It was a bright day, the kind of day their mother loved, because it gave her photos something she called depth of field, meaning the background was as sharply focused as the foreground. Their mother was standing next to him, which meant she had put the camera on a tripod and set the shutter to release on its own. Her curly blonde hair spilled over the collar of her down parka. Her right hand was bare. You can't manipulate a camera with mittens. A light meter hung around her neck. Marty stared at the photograph, so he didn't have to watch Grace cry. A lump the size of a chicken egg lodged in his throat. "Do you think Mom got our Mother's Day card?" The twins had sent the handmade card to her 2 weeks earlier, hoping it would get to her in time. "I hope so," Grace said, reaching over and taking his hand. With his free hand, Marty picked up a used tissue from the table. Sylvia and Timothy O'Hara were one of the most famous photojournalists teams in the world. Together they had climbed the highest mountains, probed the deepest caves, and rafted the wildest rivers. After Marty and Grace were born, Sylvia hung her cameras up and moved into a house in Missoula, Montana, while Timothy continued traveling and writing to support their new family. He was gone more than he was home. He missed many of the twins' early accomplishments. At age 3, Marty could run faster than his athletic mother. At the same age, Grace had a vocabulary larger than most 6th graders. At 4, Marty could unlock the back door and start the car. Fortunately, his legs were too short to reach the accelerator pedal. At the same age, Grace could add a long column of figures in her head and pick a lock as fast as a professional burglar. At 5, Marty sculpted a statue of their neighbor's aggressive dog out of mud that looked so real his mother called the pound to have it picked up. At the same age, Grace began to learn French, decided she wanted to become a doctor, and started writing the first of many diaries. using blank moleskin journals from Italy. 6 of the blank journals arrived for her by mail every year, directly from the company that made them. Her father used the same kind of journal to keep notes for his articles. Grace suspected that he had them sent, but when asked, he would merely smile and say, "They are from a secret admirer." The turning point for the O'Hara family came when the twins were 6 years old. Marty decided he wanted to catch a bear. He and Grace dug a 5-foot deep pit in the backyard, covered the opening with brush, and caught their mother, who became as angry as a bear. The twins didn't understand why she was so upset. They had not used the sharpened stakes in the bottom of the pit, which the instructions had called for. Marty wanted the bear alive for show and tell at school. While Mrs. O'Hara was in the hospital recovering from her injuries, she got to thinking about the direction her life had taken. She missed her husband. She missed her former independence. But most of all, she missed the wild places her cameras had taking her to. "If I'm going to fall into pits, I might as well get paid for it," she decided, and soon after her release, she took the twins and joined Mr. O'Hara in the field. This did not work for very long. Grace was afraid of everything that moved, and many things that didn't. Marty was afraid of nothing except ghosts, which he had only read about. For the twins' own safety, the O'Haras decided that Marty and Grace should stay at home. They hired a succession of live-in nannies to care for the children, but none of them lasted long. One by one, these disgruntled women fled the house with hastily packed bags, shouting back at the twins' panicky parents, "Your son is a wild as a hurricane, and that daughter of yours is just plain weird." But they're only first graders, Mr. and Mrs. O'Hara would yell back helplessly. To which the fleeing nanny would shout, "First graders from—" Well, you get the point. The O'Haras had a major problem with their minors, which was finally resolved when they discovered the Omega Opportunity Preparatory School while on a magazine assignment in the Swiss Alps. In many ways, the school had been very good for the twins. Grace was allowed to be as smart as she wanted to be, and Marty had learned to turn some of his wild streak into paint, strokes, and spices. But of the two, Grace liked the school best. Marty merely tolerated it, and tried to curb his wildness so he, and more important, his real sister, would not get booted out. He liked Grace that much. Grace and Marty spent several weeks with their parents every summer and saw them on most holidays, which was more than many of the other students saw of their parents in any given year. During the remaining days of summer, the twins were sent to camps and courses all over the world. Grace had attended medical camp, physics camp, astronomy camp, poetry camp, Shakespeare camp, and Latin camp. Marty had gone to mountain climbing camp, scuba diving camp, whitewater camp, and cowboy camp. It was not an ideal family relationship, but Grace and Marty had grown accustomed to their globe-trotting parents and accepted them for who they were, or at least who the twins thought they were. 6 months later. The magazines that had sent the O'Haras to the Amazon had spent a small fortune looking for them, but to no avail. Timothy and Sylvia had simply vanished, and after a few months the search was called off. Marty and Grace had not given up hope entirely, and refused to believe their parents were gone for good. But as the weeks and months went by without any word, their hope began to erode. Neither would admit this to themselves or to each other, but sometimes late at night, in the solitude of their beds, they feared that their parents were not coming back and wondered what was going to become of them. The answers to this question came in the form of an email. Subject: arrangements. From wolf@ewolf.com. To Grace O'Hara at xlink.com. CC Marty O'Hara at xlink.com. Dearest Grace and Marty, I can't tell you how sorry I am to hear of your great loss. Your mother and father's accident has had a profound effect on us all, on all of us. I wanted to contact you because I had hoped to have better news. Unfortunately, there is still no sign of your parents. During this sad time, I think it's best for you to be with family. To that end, I have arranged for you to come here and live with me. Your headmaster has been contacted, and he will assist you in getting here. I am looking forward to seeing you again. Love, Uncle Travis. Grace was totally distraught by the message. She printed it out, found Marty, marched him down to Dr. Beasel's office, and burst through his door without bothering to wait for the secretary to announce them. What does he mean, again? She shouted, waving the email before the headmaster's perplexed face. We didn't even know we had an uncle. The headmaster expected this kind of behavior from her brother, but not from little Grace, the finest student ever to walk the hallowed halls of the school. Calm yourself, Grace, Dr. Beazle admonished. Huh? Can't you see that I have a visitor? The visitor was a rough-looking man wearing orange coveralls with Geneva Pest Removal in French stenciled across his back in large purple letters formed by various rodents and insects. Dr. Beazle motioned the children over to the sofa and resumed his conversation with the burly exterminator. What are they saying? Marty whispered. His French was still not very good, despite 7 years of lessons. They're arguing, Grace whispered back. Dr. Beazle insists that there are termites in his office. Marty grinned, and Grace suspected that her brother knew more about the termites than he should. Whatever you're thinking, Grace whispered. Stop, Marty. This is serious. What's so serious about termites? That's not what I meant, Grace answered impatiently. They're about to hand us over to a complete stranger. We don't even know where this so-called uncle of ours lives. Well, it can't be worse than this place. I mean it, Marty. I want to stay right here. It's the only place I feel safe. Oh, please. The nightmares are back. You remember how it used to be? I can't live like that again. It seems to me if the nightmares are starting to bug you here, you would want to get away from them. Dr. Beazle suddenly turned to them. Did you say something about bugs? No, Marty pointed to the carpet. I was telling Grace how I always admired your rug. Dr. Beazle adjusted his earpiece and gave Marty what Luther called the stink eye, then turned his attention back to the exterminator. "Help me, Marty," Grace pleaded. Marty looked at his sister and melted inside. The joke between them had always been that he had gotten both their bodies and she had gotten both their brains. A mix-up in their mother's room. They weren't able to straighten out before it was time to go. He was her bodyguard and Grace was his brain guard. "Oh, all right," he said, "but I'm not sure what I can do. Thanks, Marty." Dr. Beazles concluded his conversation with the exterminator, walked him to the door, then turned to the O'Hara twins. "Now what's this all about?" "This," Grace handed him the email. Dr. Beazle glanced at it, then handed it back to her. "Yes, I spoke with your uncle this morning." "Well, that's more than we've ever done," Grace said heatedly. "We didn't even know he existed until we got this." She read up the email and threw it on the floor. Dr. Beazle took a step backward. He had never seen Grace so upset. Marty was surprised at her outburst as well. He had only seen her lose her temper 3 times. Once when he put a snake in her bed. It wasn't venomous. Another time when he took an innocent little peck at her moleskin. And then the year before, when he hid a bucket of cow manure in her closet. It was an emergency. "Your uncle's name is Dr. Travis Wolfe," Dr. Beazle said. "Mom has a brother?" Marty asked. "Their mother's maiden name was Wolfe." "Yes," Dr. Beasley answered. "What kind of doctor?" Marty asked. "He's a veterinarian." Marty glanced at Grace. "That's not so bad." Grace gave him another stink eye. Marty was wild about animals. "He doesn't practice anymore," Dr. Beazle continued. "He owns a company called eWolf. They make computers, software, and communication satellites. A very successful business from all accounts." Marty said. Troubled, Grace thought Marty was also wild about computers. He and Luther had secretly built a computer in their dormitory room and tapped into the school's phone line so they could surf the net without supervision. They charged the boys on their floor $10 a session, which had paid for the computer in less than a week. They were trying to earn money to get their first full-length comic book published. "So you've met him?" Grace asked. "Not exactly," Mr. Beazle looked a little uncomfortable, "but I've spoken with him on the telephone many times over the years." "I feel as if I know him." Weak, Marty thought, enjoying Dr. Beazle's discomfort. "So you and he are phone buddies?" "I wouldn't exactly characterize it that way. He calls once or twice a month to check on your progress. He's been very generous to the school, and I hope he continues his support after." Dr. Beazle cleared his throat. "But that's beside the point. What's important for you to know is that he's been your benefactor as well as the school's. He has paid your tuition since you arrived here." "Why would he do that?" Grace asked. Their parents were 2 of the highest paid journalists in the world. They weren't hurting for money. "I assumed he wanted to help your parents by paying for your education. It's not that unusual here. Why would he check on our progress? Marty asked. Concern, curiosity, I don't really know. It never occurred to me to ask. I know that this is a very difficult time for both of you, but as your legal guardian and the sole executor of your parents' estate, he thought it's best. Legal guardian, Marty said. Executor of our parents' estate, Grace added. Our parents aren't. I hope you're right, Grace, Dr. Beasley interrupted, soothingly. There is always a chance they survived, but until this is all straightened out, you'll be staying with your uncle. When? Marty asked. The day after tomorrow. The twins stared at him. There's still more than a month left of school, Grace said, shocked. We'll miss our final exams. Don't we have any choice in where we live or who we live with? At your age, I'm afraid not. The twins had recently turned 13. Grace stepped on Marty's foot, which was his cue to say or do something about this terrible situation. Marty, of course, was not in the least upset about missing his final exams, and he was intrigued by his mysterious uncle. Instead of being appalled like Grace, still he had to say something or else she would be mad at him for the rest of his life. Where does Uncle Travis live? In the Pacific Northwest, Dr. Beasley answered, near Seattle. Marty could feel Grace's blue eyes boring into him, but for one of the first times in his life, he couldn't think of anything to say. Grace, Dr. Beasley squatted down and put his bony hands on her shoulders. I want you to know that we will really miss you here. She pushed him away and ran out of the office, sobbing. Marty watched her go, then turned back to the headmaster. Will you miss me too? Dr. Beasley did not answer him. Marty nodded, then began staring at a spot just beyond the headmaster's left ear and stared, moving his eyes around the room, as if he were tracking a flying insect. What is it? Dr. Beasley asked excitedly. What do you see? I don't know, Marty stood. At first I thought it was a fly, but it's bigger than. Look, there it is. Geez, I think it's a termite. He pointed. The headmasters looked around frantically. I don't. There. Where? Over by the window. No. It's by the painting. Wow, it's crawled right behind the picture frame. Did you see it? Yes, Dr. Beasley said. I believe I did. He picked up the phone. Is that fool of an exterminator still in the building? We'll find out and send him back up here. Marty reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of dead termites, while the headmaster was distracted. He tossed them under his desk, then left the office. There were some things he was going to miss about the school. He found Grace sitting at her table in the library. She looked up at him through red-rimmed eyes. You were useless. Sorry, but Dr. Weasel wouldn't have listened to me, no matter what I'd say. I wish you wouldn't call him that. Why not? Up until their meeting, Grace could have given him a long list of reasons, but now she couldn't think of one. She'd always thought that Dr. Beasley loved having her at the school, but he had caved into their uncle's plan without a hint of protest. Look, Marty said, I'm sure there's a logical reason why Mom didn't tell us about her brother. Like, maybe she was embarrassed about him, Grace said. Or maybe he's insane, or maybe he's been in prison all these years for murder or worse. Oh, please. Where would he where would he get the money to pay for our tuition? And how could he run a computer company from a jail cell? He's the executor of Mom and Dad's estate. Maybe he's after our money. A lot of computer companies have gone out of business in the past few years. Maybe Marty picked up one of Grace's pencils and started rolling it through his fingers. Do you think Mom and Dad are okay? Grace sighed. I go back and forth, but I think that if they were dead, I would somehow know it. Marty felt the same way. I think they're okay, too, he said. They've survived worse things than a helicopter crash. What are we going to do, Marty? Marty shrugged. What we always do. Deal with it. 3. The Bishops. Grace stepped off the airplane in Seattle, wearing a gray pleated skirt, a starched white blouse, and a black blazer, with the school's coat of arms proudly sewn on the left breast pocket. Marty had on gray slacks, a wrinkled white shirt, a paint-stained school tie, and a black blazer identical to Grace's, except for the tear in the right sleeve at the elbow, and a bit of dried yolk on the label from the omelet he had just eaten. Dr. Beazle had insisted the twins wear their school uniforms so their uncle would recognize them when they arrived. On the flight, when he wasn't drawing in his sketchbook, Marty had slept. As he walked toward U.S. Customs, with his passport in hand, despite his worry about his parents, he was nearly bursting with anticipation for this new adventure. Grace had slept some as well, but she was not nearly as excited. She had spent all her waking moments writing in a diary and plotting her and Marty's return to the Omega Opportunity Preparatory School, hoping their uncle would listen to reason and was not a homicidal maniac. As they waited in the customs line, Marty spotted an older couple just beyond the gate, holding up a crude sign with O'Hara scribbled on it. He pointed them out to Grace and said, Uncle Travis must be Mom's older brother. The gray-haired man was wearing a pair of blue jeans, an old sweatshirt with Air Force written on it in faded letters, and a pair of high-top sneakers. The woman was much wider than the man, dressed in what looked like a flowered tent. That can't possibly be Uncle Travis, Grace said. $1 says it is. You're on. In the past 7 years, Grace had won a total of 211 $1 bills from him, each carefully tallied in her moleskins. Marty had not won a single dollar. Marty walked up to the couple. Uncle Travis? No, the man said. My name's Phil Bishop, and this is my wife. Bertha, the woman said, throwing her arms around them. You poor things, she drew them into her like a famished spider. We are so sorry about what happened. You're so young. She went on and on. Marty thought that Bertha's dress disguised rolls of soft flesh, but what lay beneath was as hard as bricks. It was like being hugged by an oak tree. He thought he might suffocate before she finished, but managed to wiggle free and get a gulp of air. Grace was not as lucky. Bertha held her in a headlock, from which she could not escape. "So where's Uncle Travis?" Marty asked. "He couldn't be," Phil started to answer. "He and his crew just got back this morning." Bertha interrupted. "Or he would have been here to meet you himself. He's been in the field and he had a lot of things to attend to at home. We offered to stand in for him. I hope you're not too disappointed." "What crew?" Marty asked. "His merry band of pirates," Bertha said with a laugh. "So you're not relatives?" "No, but I hope you'll consider us family." "Wolf will explain everything when you see him," Phil said. "Let's get your bags." He tossed the sign into the garbage and started down the corridor. "Grace, you haven't said a word," Bertha said, still clutching her. Grace squirmed out of her grip and glared at Marty. "You owe me $1. Marty reached into his pocket and handed her his 212th $1 bill. When Phil jerked Grace's bag off the conveyor belt, he nearly dislocated his shoulder. "What in the blazes do you have in there?" "Books," Marty said. He had told Grace to leave the books behind, but she insisted on taking a 2-week supply, or by Marty's estimate, 60 pounds of words, which is how long Grace calculated it would take to convince her uncle to send them back to the school. "I'll go see if they have a forklift," Phil said. He returned with a sturdy cart and pushed the bags to the parking lot. Half an hour later, they arrived at a beautiful lake in the center of Seattle. "This is great," Marty said. "Oh, this isn't where your uncle lives," Bertha explained. "He's 150 miles west of here." "But Seattle's on the west coast." "That's right," Phil said, dragging the luggage down a wooden dock to a small seaplane that had seen better days. "We're flying in this?" Grace asked. "I know she's not much to look at," Phil said apologetically, "but she can fly." He opened the storage compartment and a bag of food spilled out onto the dock. "We are going to die," Grace hissed in Marty's ear. Marty ignored her. He was used to her being afraid of everything. "Relax," he whispered. "I've flown in dozens of small airplanes, some worse than this." He helped Bertha pick up the bread and meat and said, "This is a lot of food." "We have 2 new stomachs to fill," Bertha said. "I'm your uncle's cook, among other things." "No kidding," Marty said. "I do a little cooking myself." He was being somewhat modest. At school, when he wasn't drawing, painting, sculpting, or cartooning, Marty was in the kitchen learning everything he could about the culinary arts. His long-range plan was to support his comic book business by becoming a world-famous chef. Even Dr. Beazle thought this was a reachable goal. Marty's only regret in leaving so quickly was that he had missed his last lessons on making the perfect broccoli souffle. He peered into the crammed compartment and was delighted to see several items he could work with. If Bertha would let him use the kitchen. "No vegetables?" "We grow our own," Bertha said, "in greenhouses, and they are all organic." "Do you have broccoli?" "A whole row." "That's great." "That's bad," Grace thought. "If this keeps up, I won't be able to separate Marty from Uncle Travis with a stick of dynamite, and he hasn't even met him yet. Phil looked up at the clouds gathering above the lake. We'd better take off. The weather's turning. If we don't, we'll be stuck on the mainland until the storm passes. The mainland? Marty asked. Your uncle lives on an island off the Washington coast, Phil said. Wow. 2 sticks of dynamite, Grace thought grimly. With a lot of grunting and groaning, Phil managed to get the twins' suitcases into the storage compartment. Marty and Grace climbed into the tattered back seats, and Bertha heaved herself into the co-pilot seat next to Phil. Buckle up, Phil said. They took off across the lake, heading west toward the Pacific Ocean. Unbeknownst to the occupants of the noisy seaplane, they passed right over the top of the large mansion perched on a hill overlooking a beautiful zoological park. Inside the mansion was a man sitting at a desk in a dimly lit room without windows. Lying next to the man was the magnificent, fully grown Caspian tiger, thought to have gone extinct a half-century earlier. The man's name was Noah Blackwood. The tiger's name was Natasha. The only thing on the desk was a computer screen and a speakerphone. Blackwood had gray hair, blue eyes, and teeth as straight and as white as piano keys. His manicured hand lay on the tiger's back. He enjoyed the feeling of the soft black and gold fur and the taut muscles beneath the tiger's skin. The phone rang. He punched a button and said, "I've been waiting for your call." "Sorry," a man said over the speaker. "I was holding off until we had better news." "And do you have better news?" "No, sir. We haven't found her yet." "I'm very disappointed. We didn't expect her to abandon her camper in Salt Lake City after we fouled the engine. She didn't take a bus, train, or airplane out of town. She didn't have enough cash to rent a car, and her credit cards were all canceled. I suspect she's still in town someplace. And I suspect you are wrong," Blackwood said coldly. The tiger tensed, feeling sparks of anger from his master's fingertips. "Did you search the camper?" "Yes, sir. It was full of books and assorted junk. But we didn't find what you're looking for. If she has it, it's with her." "She has it?" Blackwood swept his blue eyes slowly around his study, taking in the huge hermetically sealed glass dioramas lining the walls. Each of them represented years of searching, a great deal of money, and no small amount of risk. "And Wolf?" he asked. "As far as we know, he's still on the island. The bishops took off this morning for the mainland, but Dr. Wolf wasn't with them. According to our source, they're picking up his niece and nephew." "Ah, yes, the tragedy in the jungle. So the children are going to live with him." "That's our understanding." He was pleased to hear this. Raising 2 youngsters would certainly complicate things for Travis. "Wolf, anything else? Are you sending Butch out here to give us a hand?" "No, Butch is in the field on another assignment. He left yesterday, and he'll be gone for some time. We could sure use some help here. Just find the woman." Blackwood terminated the call and looked down at his magnificent tiger. "Soon, Natasha," he whispered. "Very soon."